October 15, 1946, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Thornhill and Sons Funeral Home. When Constance Merritt developed the film and saw the deceased woman's face in the contact print, she froze for a moment. Something felt wrong. She couldn't explain what exactly, just a strange sensation, as if this face shouldn't exist, as if the dead woman in the photograph was someone else entirely. Constance set the photograph aside, shrugged, decided she was tired. But an hour later, when they brought the deceased's documents for the archive, she understood. Her intuition hadn't deceived her. The death certificate read, Hartwell Daphne Louise, born 1921, died October 14, 1946, of cerebral hemorrhage. Attached to the documents was a Pennsylvania driver's license issued in 1943. Constance opened it, looked at the photograph, and froze. The woman in the 1943 license photograph looked exactly like the fresh post-mortem image she'd just taken. Angular face, narrow oval, thin lips, close-set eyes. Everything matched. But clipped to the license was another paper, an old marriage certificate from 1942. And there, in the bride section, a small photograph was pasted. Constance held it up to the light. A completely different face. Round, soft, with broad cheekbones, large eyes, full lips. A beautiful young woman, utterly unlike the one in the 1943 license. Constance laid the documents on the table, took out a magnifying loupe, carefully studied both photographs. These were two absolutely different people. Skull shape, distance between eyes, bridge of the nose, chin, nothing in common. So the woman who married in 1942 under the name Daphne Kellerman and the woman who died in 1946 under that same name, they were not the same person. Constance felt a chill inside. Someone had lived 4 years under a stolen name. Someone had taken another's place. And the real Daphne, where was she? Constance is 28 years old. She's worked as a photographer at Thornhill and Sons Funeral Home for 5 years now. She photographs the deceased for documentation, for memorial portraits, for the archive. The work is grim, but the pay is steady, the hours flexible. During these 5 years, she's grown accustomed to death, learned not to fear dead faces, not to flinch, not to turn away. But this Hartwell case hooked her differently. This wasn't the horror of death. This was the horror of substitution. Someone had stolen another's life. Someone had spent 4 years wearing another's name, sleeping in another's bed, collecting another's widow's pension from the War Department, and died peacefully, in her own apartment, undetected by anyone. Constance took the documents, placed them in a folder, decided to investigate. The next day, October 16th, she went to the Philadelphia County Records Office, asked them to pull the marriage registration file for Hartwell. The clerk, an elderly woman in thick spectacles, brought a folder. Constance opened it. Marriage record, March 12, 1942. Groom, Hartwell, Marshall Thaddeus, born 1920. Bride, Kellerman, Daphne Louise, born 1921. Attached to the record was a photograph, the young husband and wife. Constance peered at the bride's face, round face, broad cheekbones, large eyes, the same woman from the marriage certificate. "Excuse me," Constance asked the clerk. "Is it possible to see when Mrs. Hartwell obtained her driver's license? Are there records?" The clerk nodded, left, returned with another folder. License issued July 3, 1943. First license for this individual. "Can I see the application photograph?" The clerk showed her the file. The photograph matched the one in the current license, the angular face, the imposter's face. Constance nodded. So, in 1943, a license was issued, and in that photograph, already a different woman, the one who died in 1946. So the substitution happened between March 1942 and July 1943. But when exactly? Constance asked them to find birth records for Hartwell's children. The clerk brought 3 certificates. Hartwell Miriam Louise, born January 15, 1943. Hartwell Randolph Marshall, born June 3, 1944. Hartwell Cordelia Jane, born November 22, 1945. Constance wrote down the dates. All 3 born between 1943 and 1945. The first child was born 10 months after the wedding in March 1942. So, whoever married Marshall in 1942 was the same woman who bore him 3 children and died in 1946. But was she the real Daphne? Or already the imposter? Constance thought hard. She needed a lead. She decided to act boldly. Drove to Locust Street, to number 847, climbed to apartment 4C. Knocked. The door was opened by a woman about 33 years old, the deceased's eldest daughter, Miriam. Constance said. Miriam nodded wearily. Miriam thought. She left, returned with a print, handed it to Constance. She looked and immediately recognized it. This was the same photograph from the county records archive. Young couple, 1942. Bride with round face. Constance asked carefully. Constance turned the photograph over. On the back, in old-fashioned handwriting. Miriam shook her head. Constance nodded, thanked her, said goodbye. Went downstairs, walked outside. Sat on a bench in the courtyard, pulled out her notebook. Wrote, ___, quote, _, 14_____. The answer was obvious, because she feared someone would notice the discrepancy, because she knew she wasn't the real Daphne. But then, who was she? And where was the real Daphne? Constance returned to the county records office the next day. Requested access to the missing persons database for the 1940s. The clerk produced a card file. Constance began flipping through cards with the surname Kellerman. Found a record. Kellerman, Daphne Louise, born 1921. Reported missing August 3, 1941. Last known residence, Philadelphia, Pine Street, number 412, boarding house. Missing person report filed by fiancé Hartwell, Marshall Thaddeus. Constance copied all the data. So, Daphne disappeared 7 months before the wedding. But the wedding still took place. So, someone took her place and married under her name. Constance asked the clerk to find the investigation file. The woman brought a thin folder. Inside, Marshall's statement, witness interview protocols, notice of case closure. Constance read the statement. Hartwell wrote, ___, quote, _15__, witness interview protocol. Neighbors from the boarding house were questioned. Landlady Edith Gallagher testified. ___, quote, _16__, Inez Vargas. Constance wrote down the name. So Daphne went to see her girlfriend Inez and didn't return. Case closure notice. October 15, 1941. Due to absence of data regarding the whereabouts of Kellerman D.L., investigation is closed. Constance closed the folder. A picture was forming in her mind. August 3, 1941. Daphne goes to see her friend Inez. Disappears. 7 months later, March 12, 1942, Marshall Hartwell marries a woman who calls herself Daphne. But in reality, this is, probably, Inez. She needed to find data on Inez Vargas. Constance asked the clerk to check driver's license records. Half an hour later, the woman returned with a record. Vargas, Inez Carmen, born 1921, born in Allentown, Pennsylvania. No driver's license on file. Last known address, Walnut Street, number 534, apartment 2B. Last notation in city directory, August 1941, address listed as vacant. August 1941, right after Daphne's disappearance. Constance wrote down the data. Everything fit together. Inez Vargas disappeared from her apartment in August 1941 And several months later, a woman appeared who married under the name Daphne Kellerman. But how did Inez obtain Daphne's documents? Stole them? Or did Daphne hand them over herself before disappearing? Constance decided to act decisively. She went to the police precinct, requested a meeting with a detective. The detective, a man about 45 with a weary face, listened to her story, looked at the documents. Marriage certificate with a photograph of one woman. 1943 license with a photograph of a completely different one. "You're saying the woman who died last week wasn't Mrs. Hartwell?" he clarified. "Yes," Constance said firmly. "The real Daphne Hartwell disappeared in August 1941, and her place was taken by Inez Vargas. She married under a stolen name, lived 4 years, died, never exposed by anyone." The detective nodded. "Serious accusation. If you're wrong, that's slander against the deceased." "Check the archives," Constance insisted. "Compare the photographs. These are two different people." The detective promised to investigate. Constance left him all the copies, said goodbye, left. She walked along Chestnut Street thinking, now what? Wait for the police to verify? Or continue investigating herself? She decided to continue. 2 days later, Constance went to the Philadelphia Public Library, requested access to newspaper archives for August 1941, began looking through editions from the beginning of the month. August 4th, 1941. Small notice on page 7. Woman missing. Philadelphia police seek information regarding Daphne Kellerman, 20, who disappeared from Pine Street boarding house evening of August 3rd. Anyone with information, please contact Detective Carson. August 12th, 1941. Another notice. Search continues for missing woman. Daphne Kellerman still not located. Fiancé offers $50 reward for information. August 20th, 1941. Final notice. Missing woman case closed. Police unable to locate Daphne Kellerman. Case filed as unsolved. Constance wrote down the dates. The investigation lasted only 17 days. Very brief. Why so short? She requested the crime reports for August 1941. Found a thick folder. Began reading through. August 7th, 1941. Body found in Fairmount Park. Female, approximately 20 years old. Cause of death, strangulation. Identity unknown. No identifying documents on person. Constance felt her heart race. Could this be Daphne? She continued reading. August 10th, 1941. Update. Unidentified body from Fairmount Park remains unidentified. Buried in Pottersfield. Unmarked grave. August 15th, 1941. Another body found. Female, approximately 25 years old. Found in Schuylkill River. Cause of death, drowning, but evidence of blunt force trauma to skull. No identification. 2 unidentified female bodies in 1 week, and both around the time Daphne disappeared. Constance made copies of the articles, put them in her folder, went to the police precinct again. Detective Lawrence Carson, the same one mentioned in the 1941 newspapers, was still active duty. Constance found him at the precinct. He was about 50 now, graying at the temples. She knocked on his office door. He looked up from paperwork. Carson leaned back in his chair. Quote 28. Quote 29. Quote. Carson was silent, then gestured to a chair. Quote 30. Quote. Constance laid out all the documents, photographs, certificates, newspaper clippings. Carson studied them carefully. Finally said, quote 31, quote. Quote 32, quote. Constance asked. Carson frowned. Quote 33. Carson thought. Constance said. Carson examined the wedding photo and the license photo side by side. His expression darkened. Carson leaned forward. Constance asked. Carson said. Carson's then the very differently understanded wedding photo. Carson said, They want the photo in the other lice. They didn't sew everything in other lice. They had never learned anything of them. Carson said, they felt no to me this wedding to the WWII in the list, but noticeably the special of the mini for it in factor. Carson said, they have never learned any them to litter in the best photo and speaking around and self of the Texas. Carson said, they have never learned any bigger an expression that happened and license understanded. The license understanded, it's not only so neighboring to them. Carson said, they have never learned any bigger an expression that happened and license understanded. The homicide division, Constance met with them several times, provided all her evidence. Carson was determined, almost driven. He told her, they obtained court orders to exhume the 2 Jane Does from 1941. December 3, 1946. The first exhumation body from Fairmount Park, buried in Potter's Field. The medical examiner examined the remains carefully. Female, early 20s, strangled. The body had been in the ground for 5 years, but bone structure was intact. On the left shoulder blade, barely visible in the decomposed tissue, the examiner found it. A distinctive birthmark shaped like a crescent moon, preserved in the deeper skin layers. Constance was present at the examination. When the medical examiner pointed it out, Carson closed his eyes. We missed it, he said quietly. In 1941 we looked but didn't see it. The decomposition obscured it. The examiner nodded. It's easy to miss in a decomposed body. You need to know exactly where to look. They obtained Daphne's dental records from her childhood dentist in Scranton. The comparison was definitive. The body was Daphne Louise Kellerman. She'd been murdered on or around August 3, 1941. Strangled. Dumped in Fairmount Park. Found 4 days later but never identified. For 5 years she'd lain in an unmarked grave while her murderer lived in her name, raised children in her house, slept beside her fiancé. The second exhumation was conducted December 10, 1946. Body from Schuylkill River, female, mid-20s. The medical examiner determined cause of death was drowning, but also found evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, likely struck unconscious, then thrown in the water. Cresswell cross-referenced missing persons from August 1941. Found a match. Loretta Pike, 24, reported missing August 9th by her younger sister Florence. Last seen leaving her apartment on Walnut Street the evening of August 8th. Never came home. Dental records confirmed. The body was Loretta Pike. Constance reviewed the case files. Loretta Pike lived on Walnut Street, the same street where Inez Vargas had lived. Building 538, just 4 doors down from Inez's apartment at 534. They were neighbors. Constance felt ice in her veins. 2 women dead, both connected to Inez Vargas. Daphne, the friend. Loretta, the neighbor. Detective Cresswell expanded the investigation, began looking into Inez's background. Inez Carmen Vargas was born in Allentown in 1921, moved to Philadelphia in 1939, worked as a seamstress in a garment factory on Market Street, lived alone in a small apartment on Walnut Street. According to former neighbors interviewed by Cresswell, Inez was quiet, kept to herself, had few friends, seemed lonely. One neighbor, Mrs. Abigail Porter, recalled, __quote _48 _ Cresswell found Inez's former employer at the garment factory. The floor supervisor, a woman named Gertrude Walsh, remembered her. Good worker, reliable, quiet. But there was something off about her. She'd stare at the other girls, especially the pretty ones, like she was studying them. Made people uncomfortable. One girl said Inez once asked her detailed questions about her life, where she grew up, how she talked, what her family was like. Odd questions. Another coworker, Helen Reeves, said, Inez told me once she wished she could be someone else, said she hated her life, hated being invisible, hated that no one noticed her. I thought she was just lonely. Didn't realize she meant it literally. The picture became clearer. Inez Vargas had been obsessed with becoming someone else, someone prettier, luckier, more loved. And when she saw Daphne, beautiful, engaged, happy, she wanted to be her. Carson and Cresswell interviewed Marshall Hartwell in late December. He came to the police station, sat across from them, looked hollow-eyed. "Mr. Hartwell," Carson said gently, "I need to ask you about your wife, the woman you married in 1942. Marshall nodded slowly. "What about her? Did you notice anything unusual? Anything different about her compared to Daphne before she disappeared?" Marshall was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I was shipped out to England 2 weeks after Daphne disappeared. August 1941. Didn't come back until February 1942. When I saw her again in March, she looked different. I thought it was the stress of waiting, worrying about me overseas. She'd lost some weight. Her voice sounded slightly different, but I figured grief and anxiety had changed her. I'd been through hell in Europe. I knew people change." "Did she ever do anything that seemed unlike Daphne?" Marshall thought hard. "She didn't like talking about the past. Before I shipped out, Daphne loved telling stories about her childhood in Scranton, her family, memories we shared. After I came back, she avoided those topics. Said it was too painful to remember with the war on. I didn't push. Everyone was trying to forget something in those days." "Did she remember specific details? Things only Daphne would know?" "She knew some things. Names of my family members, places in Philadelphia. But some things she got wrong. Once I mentioned our first date at the Independence Hall steps, and she looked confused for a second. Then said she remembered. Another time I brought up a private joke we'd had, and she didn't react. I thought she'd just forgotten. Now I understand. She was never there. Those memories weren't hers." Marshall's hands trembled. He looked at Carson. Quote 60, quote 61. Marshall closed his eyes. A tear rolled down his cheek. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 62, underscore, underscore. Carson put a hand on his shoulder. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 63, underscore. Underscore. Cresswell continued investigating. He found a critical piece of evidence in January 1947. A ledger from the boarding house where Daphne had lived. The landlady, Edith Gallagher, had kept detailed records. On August 3, 1941, she'd noted, "Daphne K. went out 6:15 p.m. to visit I. Vargas on Walnut Street. Took overnight bag. Said might stay through Monday if they made weekend plans." An overnight bag Daphne had packed for a potential weekend stay. Cresswell showed Constance the entry. She packed for a visit. So she planned to spend time with Inez. But she never made it home. Or if she did make it to Inez's apartment, she never left alive. Constance studied the entry. What if Inez invited her specifically to kill her? Asked her to bring clothes, suggested they'd spend the weekend together, maybe go somewhere on Monday. Daphne trusted her, packed a bag, went to Inez's apartment, and Inez murdered her there. And took her documents from the bag, Cresswell added. Everything Daphne had with her. Probably included her birth certificate, some personal letters, maybe even her driver's license if she'd recently gotten one. Everything Inez needed to study her identity. But why kill Loretta Pike? Constance asked. Cresswell had a theory. Loretta lived 4 doors down from Inez. On August 8th, 5 days after Daphne's murder, Loretta disappears. I think Loretta saw something. Maybe saw Daphne enter Inez's apartment that Sunday evening and never leave. Maybe saw Inez leaving late at night with a large bundle, Daphne's body. Maybe Loretta started asking questions. Inez couldn't risk a witness, so she killed her too. Carson added, and Inez was smart. She waited. Didn't rush into taking Daphne's place immediately. She disappeared from Walnut Street in August 1941, went into hiding somewhere, spent months preparing. Studying Daphne's life, practicing her mannerisms, memorizing details Marshall had probably told Daphne in letters. Then, when Marshall came back from Europe in February 1942, grieving and desperate for normalcy, she appeared, claimed to be Daphne. And he wanted to believe it so badly, he didn't look too closely. The case drew significant attention in Philadelphia. Newspapers ran headlines. Bride was imposter. Woman lived 4 years under murdered friend's name. And war widow revealed as killer who stole victim's identity. The Hartwell children, Miriam, Randolph, and Cordelia, were devastated. They learned their mother wasn't who they thought, that their family history was built on murder and deception. Constance met with Miriam in February 1947. The woman looked aged beyond her 33 years, exhausted. Quote, 74. Quote, 75, Constance said carefully. Miriam shook her head. Constance had no answer that could heal that wound. In March 1947, the Philadelphia authorities held a formal reburial for Daphne Kellerman. Her remains were moved from Potter's Field to Mount Moriah Cemetery, Section 12, Plot 47. A proper headstone was erected. Daphne Louise Kellerman, 1921 to 1941, beloved daughter, devoted fiancée, stolen from life, restored in memory. Marshall Hartwell attended the service. So did Daphne's elderly parents, Edward and Ruth Kellerman, who traveled from Scranton. They wept over the grave of the daughter who'd been missing for 5 years. Ruth Kellerman told Constance through her tears, quote, _78 ___. Constance stood at the back of the small gathering, watched as they lowered the casket into the ground, thought about how close this truth had come to staying buried forever. If she hadn't noticed the discrepancy in those photographs, Daphne would have remained nameless forever. Her parents would have died never knowing what happened to their daughter. Loretta Pike was reburied the same week in Holy Cross Cemetery. Her younger sister, Florence Doyle, married now, 26 years old, placed flowers on the grave. Loretta Marie Pike, 1917 to 1941. Loving sister, faithful friend, silenced, but not forgotten. Florence told Constance, "For 5 years I thought my sister had abandoned me, left Philadelphia without a word. I was angry at her, hurt. Now I know she was murdered just for being in the wrong place. She probably saw something she shouldn't have, and it cost her her life. She was 24 years old. She deserved to live." Constance asked, "Did Loretta ever mention knowing Inez Vargas?" Florence thought, "Once. She said there was a strange woman a few doors down who gave her an uncomfortable feeling. Watched people too closely. That must have been Inez. If only Loretta had stayed away from her." The legal aftermath was complicated. Since Inez Vargas was dead, no criminal prosecution was possible. But the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office issued a formal finding in April 1947. Quote, _82 Marshall Hartwell filed to have his marriage to Inez legally annulled. The court granted it in May 1947. In the eyes of the law, his marriage had never existed. His children's birth certificates were amended to show their mother as Inez Carmen Vargas, alias Daphne Louise Hartwell, fraudulent identity. The amendments were necessary for legal clarity, but they caused the children additional pain. Randolph, 13 years old, told a social worker, "Now when people look at my birth certificate, they'll see my mother was a fraud. How do I explain that to anyone?" There was no good answer. In September 1947, Constance visited the graves again, placed flowers on both, Daphne's and Loretta's, stood in silence for several minutes. She thought about the chain of events. August 3, 1941, Daphne goes to visit Inez carrying an overnight bag. Inez murders her, probably in the apartment, disposes of the body in Fairmount Park under cover of darkness, takes Daphne's documents and personal effects. August 8, 1941. Loretta Pike notices something suspicious. Maybe she saw Inez carrying something heavy wrapped in blankets. Maybe she heard sounds of struggle through the thin apartment walls. Maybe she simply asked too many questions about why Daphne never came home. Inez panics, strikes Loretta unconscious, throws her body in the Schuylkill River. August 15, 1941. Inez abandons her apartment, disappears, spends the next 7 months in hiding, probably in a cheap rooming house under a false name, studying everything she can about Daphne's life. Reading letters Marshall sent to Daphne, practicing Daphne's signature, rehearsing how to be her. February 1942. Marshall returns from England, broken by war, desperate for his fiancée. Inez contacts him, claims to be Daphne, says she'd been staying with relatives in the countryside, too traumatized to return to Philadelphia. Marshall, eager to believe, accepts her explanation. March 12, 1942. They marry. Inez becomes Mrs. Marshall Hartwell, becomes Daphne Hartwell, and no one suspects. For 4 years, Inez lives as Daphne, has 3 children, plays the role perfectly. Until October 14, 1946, when a cerebral hemorrhage ends her life at age 25. And the secret would have died with her, if not for a photographer's observant eye. Years passed. In 1950, Constance left Thornhill & Sons funeral home and took a position at the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's office as a forensic photographer. The Hartwell case had changed her trajectory. She no longer wanted just to document death. She wanted to solve it, to find truth in the details others overlooked. She became known for her meticulous work. Other detectives began consulting her when photographs didn't match documents, when identities seemed questionable, when something about a death scene didn't look right. In 1953, she helped identify a John Doe who'd been found in the Delaware River. His face was badly decomposed, but Constance compared bone structure in the skull radiographs to a missing person's military ID photo from the records office. She measured distances between specific cranial landmarks, overlaid the images, found 12 points of correlation. The match was conclusive. Another nameless body reclaimed. In 1956, she exposed another imposter, a man claiming to be a decorated war veteran who'd supposedly lost his memory in combat. He was collecting disability payments under a dead soldier's name. Constance compared photographs from before and after his claimed amnesia. Different ear structure, different eyebrow arch, different shape of the orbital bones. Turned out he'd stolen the identity of a soldier who died at Normandy. The real veteran's family finally got closure. Each case reinforced what she'd learned in 1946. Photographs don't lie. Faces tell truths that words conceal. Bone structure doesn't change. The camera captures what people try to hide. In 1958, 12 years after Inez's death, Constance encountered Cordelia Hartwell, the youngest daughter, on Market Street. Cordelia was 22 now, working as an elementary school teacher. Constance greeted her. Cordelia recognized her, offered a small smile. __quote _85 __, Constance asked. Cordelia considered the question. Quote 86, quote 87, quote 88. Constance felt deep sympathy. Quote 89, quote. Cordelia shook her head firmly. Quote 90, quote. Constance admired her strength. Quote 91, quote 92. Cordelia corrected. Quote 93. They parted ways. Constance watched her walk down the street, straight-backed, purposeful. A young woman refusing to be crushed by a legacy of murder. In 1960, Constance was contacted by a journalist named Robert Ashford writing a book about unsolved crimes. He wanted to include the Hartwell case as a chapter on delayed justice. Constance met with him several times, provided detailed background, reviewed his draft carefully. The chapter was titled __quote _94 __. When the book was published in 1961, Constance received numerous letters from readers. Some thanked her for seeking justice. Others criticized her for destroying the Hartwell children's peace. One letter, unsigned, said, "You should have left well enough alone. The woman was dead, the children were happy in their ignorance. What good did digging up the past accomplish? You gave them pain they didn't need to have. Some truths should stay buried." Constance thought about that criticism for a long time. Finally, she wrote a response in her journal, never sent, but preserved in her papers. The good it accomplished was this: Daphne Kellerman has a grave with her real name on it. Loretta Pike has a grave with her real name on it. Their families know what happened to them. They can grieve properly instead of wondering forever. That is worth something. Perhaps not everything, but something substantial. The dead deserve to be remembered as themselves, not as nameless victims or eternal mysteries. And the living deserve truth, however painful, because truth is the foundation of genuine peace. The Hartwell children suffered when they learned, yes, but they also gained something: certainty, reality, a foundation on which to build honest lives. That matters. In 1965, 19 years after the discovery, Constance visited Mount Moriah Cemetery again. Daphne's grave was well maintained. Fresh flowers lay on the stone, probably from her parents who still made the journey from Scranton several times a year despite their advanced age. Constance placed her own flowers beside theirs, white roses, stood silently, head bowed. She thought about the photograph that started everything, that moment of trained observation, of noticing what didn't match, that willingness to trust her professional instinct over convenience, that decision to investigate rather than file the documents and forget. If she'd ignored that instinct, if she'd dismissed the discrepancy as fatigue or imagination, the truth would have stayed buried. Daphne and Loretta would have remained nameless Jane Does in Potter's Field. Inez would have been remembered as a respectable widow and devoted mother. The Hartwell children would have lived in comfortable ignorance. But Constance hadn't ignored it. And that single decision had rippled outward through time, changing lives, restoring names, delivering delayed but real justice. She left the cemetery as autumn twilight settled over Philadelphia. The city lights flickered on across the darkening landscape. Somewhere in those streets, other secrets waited. Other truths buried beneath layers of deception and time. But as long as someone was willing to look closely, to question inconsistencies, to investigate rather than assume, those truths could be found. Justice could still arrive, even decades late. In 1968, Detective Lawrence Carson died of a heart attack at age 57. His obituary mentioned his long career in the Philadelphia Police Department, but gave special prominence to the Hartwell case. Detective Carson was known for his tenacity and integrity. In 1946, he reopened a 5-year-old missing persons case after photographer Constance Merritt brought him evidence of identity fraud. His willingness to admit the original investigation had missed critical details, and his determination to correct that error resulted in the identification of 2 murder victims and the exposure of their killer. He often said it was the most important case of his career because it reminded him that justice has no expiration date. Constance attended his funeral, spoke briefly with his widow, laid a wreath that read, "For a detective who cared more about truth than pride." Epilogue, 1970. Constance is 52 years old. She's retired from the medical examiner's office, lives alone in a small apartment in Rittenhouse Square. She occasionally takes freelance work, restoring old photographs from museums and historical societies, consulting on cold cases when detectives need her expertise. One afternoon in April, she receives a telephone call from an unfamiliar woman. "Miss Merritt? My name is Veronica Ashton. I'm Miriam Hartwell's daughter, the granddaughter of Inez Vargas. I'd like to meet you, if you're willing." Constance is surprised. "Meet me? For what purpose?" "To thank you, and to ask you some questions. I'm writing my master's thesis on identity fraud in the 1940s, and I want to include my family's story. But I want to understand it properly. My grandmother, Miriam, told me you were the one who discovered the truth. She says you changed everything." They meet 2 days later at a cafe on Walnut Street, ironically just a few blocks from where Inez Vargas once lived. Veronica is 27, composed, intelligent. She has a tape recorder and a notebook. "Thank you for meeting me," she begins. "This isn't easy for my family to talk about, but I believe it's important. People need to know this kind of thing happened, that crimes sometimes stayed hidden for years, that justice, when it finally came, was painful but necessary." Constance studies her. "Your grandmother gave you permission to write about this?" "She encouraged it. She said she spent too many years hiding from the truth, being ashamed. Now she's 77 years old. She wants the story told properly before everyone who remembers it is gone. She wants people to understand what happened and why truth matters even when it hurts." "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How did you realize something was wrong? What made you keep investigating when it would have been easier to ignore it? What did you feel when you confirmed your suspicions?" Constance takes a breath, reaches back through the years. October 15th, 1946. I was developing photographs in the darkroom at Thornhill and Sons. I'd photographed Mrs. Hartwell's body for the death records. When I saw the print, something bothered me. I couldn't identify what at first, just a feeling. Then they brought her documents, and I saw the marriage photo from 1942. A completely different face. Not similar, different. And I knew immediately. These were two separate people. "What did you do?" I sat with it for a few hours, questioned myself, wondered if I was imagining things, if the post-mortem changes had confused me. But I'm trained to see past those changes. I know bone structure. I know facial architecture. And these were not the same woman. So I went to the county records office, started checking, found more discrepancies, built the case piece by piece. Were you afraid? Of being wrong? No, I was certain. Photographs don't lie, Miss Ashton. Not to someone who knows how to read them. I was afraid of what it meant, though. That someone had murdered and stolen and gotten away with it for years. That the truth had been invisible to everyone. That made me afraid of how many other truths might be hiding in plain sight. Veronica makes notes, asks more questions. Constance answers them all honestly. Finally, Veronica asks, "Do you think my grandmother, Miriam, has made peace with it?" Constance considers. "I think she's made acceptance of it, which is different from peace, but perhaps more durable. She knows who her mother really was. She knows what crimes were committed. She's chosen to acknowledge that reality instead of denying it. That's not peace, but it's integrity. And integrity is worth something." "What about my great-aunt Cordelia and my great-uncle Randolph?" "I haven't spoken to Randolph in years. Last I heard, he'd moved to California, changed his name legally, tried to start over. That's his choice. Cordelia chose differently. She kept the name, faced it directly. Both responses are valid. There's no right way to carry a burden like that." Veronica nods, understanding. They talk for another hour. Constance shares details she's never told anyone else. The exact moment she knew for certain. The conversation with Detective Carson, the day of Daphne's reburial. When they finally part, Veronica thanks her. "This matters, not just for my thesis, for my family. We need to understand our own history, and you're part of that history." Constance watches her leave, then sits alone with her coffee for a while. She thinks, the story continues. It doesn't end with discovery, or with justice, or even with death. It passes to the next generation, and the next, becomes part of a family's identity, becomes a lesson about truth and consequences. And that's as it should be. Because history isn't just dates and facts, it's the weight we carry forward, the truths we choose to face or flee. Constance returns home that evening, sits by her window, watches the sun set over Philadelphia. The city has changed so much since 1946. New buildings, new highways, new neighborhoods. But the bones of the city remain. The old streets, the cemeteries, the archives. And in those archives, preserved forever, the truth about Daphne Kellerman and Loretta Pike and Inez Vargas. Constance opens a drawer in her desk, takes out a folder. Inside, copies of the photographs that started everything. The wedding photo from 1942, showing the real Daphne's round, beautiful face. The license photo from 1943, showing Inez's angular, harder features. She looks at them side by side, as she did 24 years ago. Two different women. One stolen life, one determined photographer who noticed. And because she noticed, because she investigated, because she refused to let the inconsistency pass, two murdered women got their names back, got their graves, got their place in the historical record. That's not nothing. That's everything. Constance puts the photographs away, closes the drawer. Outside, the city lights come on, one by one, pushing back the darkness. And she thinks, as long as someone is watching, as long as someone is willing to see what doesn't fit, as long as someone cares enough to investigate, the truth can still be found. Justice can still be done. The dead can still be remembered. And that is enough.